The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky was already heavy with the promise of a storm. Dark clouds, thick and swollen, stretched across the horizon, swallowing the late afternoon sun. The road ahead was slick with an eerie sheen, reflecting the dull glow of the headlights. Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles whitening as he guided the SUV down the isolated stretch of highway. The further they drove, the more the landscape shifted, rolling hills flattening into dense, skeletal trees that lined the road like silent sentinels. His wife, Emily, sat beside him, scrolling through her phone in search of a signal. The bars flickered in and out, the last remnants of civilization slipping away. In the back seat, their teenage daughter Hannah sat with her arms crossed, earbuds in, staring out the rain-speckled window. Her reflection stared back at her, faint, distorted. Her little brother Noah was beside her, absent-mindedly tracing raindrops with his fingers on the cold glass, his small face pressed against the window. "This is ridiculous," Hannah muttered, pulling one earbud out. "Why couldn't we just fly?" Daniel sighed. They had been over this before. The trip was supposed to be about reconnecting as a family, time away from the constant distractions of life. No work, no phones, no social media, just the four of them, together. "Because we wanted an adventure," Emily answered, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. "Besides, a road trip gives us time to talk." Hannah let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Yeah, great idea." Danielle ignored her tone and focused on the road. They had left the highway over an hour ago, taking a more scenic route through the countryside. But now, the roads were empty, winding deeper into the forested outskirts of the state. The trees pressed in closer, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the dying light. Emily looked up from her phone, frustration creasing her forehead. "No signal." "Of course not," Hannah muttered. "Hey," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Enough of that. This is supposed to be fun." "Fun?" Hannah scoffed. "We're in the middle of nowhere, and it looks like it's about to pour. How is this fun?" Daniel didn't answer. He wouldn't admit it, but the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine had been growing stronger with each mile. Something about the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, as if the storm was pressing down on them, whispering its arrival before it even began. Noah suddenly sat up straighter, pointing at the sky. "Dad, the clouds look weird." Daniel stole a glance through the windshield. The clouds had darkened significantly, an unnatural shade of charcoal swirling in slow, ominous waves. A low rumble of thunder vibrated through the air, distant, but growing closer. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should find a place to stop for the night. A motel or something." "There hasn't been a town for miles," Daniel replied, scanning the roadside. "We can keep going. The GPS said there's a main road up ahead that connects back to the highway." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded. The storm was coming, but they still had time. Or so they thought. The first raindrops splattered against the windshield, thick and heavy. The wipers scraped against the glass as Daniel switched them on, their rhythmic sweep, the only sound in the growing silence. Then the radio cut out. A burst of static hissed through the speakers before the station went completely dead. Daniel frowned, turning the knob. But every channel was the same. Nothing but white noise. Hannah pulled out her phone, frowning. No signal here either. A flash of lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the road for the briefest moment. The trees cast long, jagged shadows across the pavement, and for a second, just a second, Daniel thought he saw something standing in the tree line, a figure. By the time the darkness swallowed the landscape again, it was gone. His hands tightened on the wheel. Did anyone see that? Emily turned to him. See what? Daniel hesitated. It was probably nothing. His eyes playing tricks on him. He was just tired from driving. Nothing, he said, shaking it off. Just the trees. The rain began to pick up, hammering against the windshield. The road grew slick, the tires humming against wet asphalt. The headlights barely cut through the thickening mist that had begun rolling in from the forest. It was getting harder to see. Then, out of nowhere, a shape appeared in the middle of the road. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat. He slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The SUV skidded, sliding sideways as the rain blurred everything into a dizzying smear of gray and black. Emily screamed. Hannah braced herself, grabbing Noah, who yelped in fear. The vehicle finally came to a jarring stop. Daniel's pulse pounded as he gripped the wheel, his breath coming in short gasps. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Emily's shaking voice broke the silence. Daniel, what the hell was that? Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the road ahead. But whatever had been there was gone. The rain continued to pour. The storm had arrived, and something else had arrived with it. The silence in the car was suffocating. Only the steady thrum of the rain against the windshield and the occasional crackle of distant thunder filled the void. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he loosened his grip on the wheel. His pulse still pounded in his ears. He could feel Emily's gaze burning into the side of his face, waiting for an explanation. One he didn't have. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw something. Someone standing in the road. Emily turned to look out the window, peering into the curtain of rain. But there's nothing there now. Daniel swallowed. She was right. Whatever had been there was gone. No body, no footprints, just the empty road stretching ahead, wet and gleaming under the headlights. Noah whimpered from the back seat, his voice small. I saw it too. Daniel twisted in his seat, his eyes locking onto his son's pale face. You did? Noah nodded, slowly, his fingers gripping his stuffed dinosaur. A habit he hadn't had since he was younger. It was tall. His voice quivered. It didn't move. It was just watching. A shiver crawled up Daniel's spine. He looked at Hannah, who had her arms crossed tightly, eyes narrowed at the window. "What about you?" he asked. Hannah shook her head, but her voice betrayed her unease. "I don't know. It was so fast. Maybe it was just an animal." Emily exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "Whatever it was, we need to get out of here. We shouldn't just be sitting in the middle of the road." Daniel nodded, shifting the car back into drive. The SUV's tires rolled forward hesitantly, cutting through the waterlogged pavement. The road twisted and dipped, barely visible through the heavy downpour. The storm was getting worse. The road narrows. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches stretching over the road like grasping fingers. The headlights flickered slightly as they navigated the winding path. Emily checked her phone again. Still nothing. No service. Daniel frowned. The storm shouldn't be causing this much interference. It felt like they had slipped into some forgotten part of the world, cut off from everything. Minutes passed. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but something wasn't right. Hannah's voice cut through the silence. Dad, haven't we passed that tree before?" Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror. "What do you mean?" "I mean..." Hannah sat up straighter, staring out the window. "That tree, the one with the weird broken branch. I swear I've seen it 3 times now." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. He hadn't been paying attention to the trees, only the road. But now that she mentioned it, a terrible thought crept into his mind. Were they going in circles? Emily's breathing quickened. "Daniel, the GPS, try it again." He reached for his phone, but his stomach dropped when he saw the screen. The GPS was still open, but the map was completely blank. No roads, no location, just an empty void. "What the hell?" Daniel whispered. Then the radio crackled to life. A burst of static filled the car, making everyone jump. But beneath the white noise, something else was there. A voice. "Turn back." Daniel's blood ran cold. Emily gasped. "Did you hear that?" The static warbled and the voice returned, distorted, broken, barely understandable. "Leave while you can." Then, as suddenly as it had come, the radio went silent again. The only sound left was the relentless pounding of the rain. Deep, suffocating fear settled over them. "What the hell is going on?" Hannah whispered. No one had an answer. And in the darkness beyond the trees, something moved. The SUV rolled forward cautiously, its tires slicing through the growing puddles on the cracked asphalt. The rain showed no sign of stopping. If anything, it was getting worse, thicker, heavier, as if the sky was being wrung dry above them. Inside the car, the silence was as oppressive as the storm. No one spoke. The radio's cryptic warning still echoed in their minds. "Turn back. Leave while you can." Daniel's fingers were stiff on the steering wheel. He could feel the unease rolling off Emily in waves beside him. Hannah kept shifting in her seat, constantly looking over her shoulder, and Noah, sweet, quiet Noah, held onto his stuffed dinosaur like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "I don't like this," Emily finally whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't either. Up ahead the road narrowed, further, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The trees were so close now that their branches scraped against the roof of the car like skeletal fingers. And then the road simply ended. Daniel slammed the brakes. The SUV skidded slightly before coming to a full stop. The headlights shone into the void beyond, illuminating nothing but mud, water, and gnarled roots. The road they had been following, endlessly winding, stretching for miles, was just gone. A flood had swallowed it whole. Emily sucked in a sharp breath. Oh my God. Daniel put the car in park and unbuckled his seatbelt. "I need to check this out." "No." Emily reached for him, her fingers clutching his arm. "Daniel, don't. We can't just sit here." He exhaled, trying to steady himself. "I just need to see how bad it is. Stay in the car." Emily looked like she wanted to protest, but she didn't. She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. Daniel opened the door, stepping into the downpour. The rain was an instant assault, drenching him to the bone. The cold seeped through his jacket, chilling his skin. The wind howled through the trees, bending them at unnatural angles. He took a cautious step forward, boots sinking into the saturated ground. The road truly was gone. What remained was a rushing river of floodwater, tearing through the forest with unnatural force. Daniel's stomach twisted. There was no way to drive through it. They were cut off. A loud snap echoed through the trees, and he turned sharply, his heart slamming against his ribs. Nothing. Just trees, just shadows. But the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Daniel took a step back toward the SUV, his instincts screaming at him to move faster. The wind picked up, carrying something strange with it. Whispers. Not the howl of the storm, not the rustling of trees. Actual whispers. Daniel's breath hitched. He spun around, scanning the darkness. Then, something shifted in his peripheral vision. His eyes darted to the left, toward the tree line. For the briefest moment, he saw them. Figures. Tall, motionless figures standing between the trees. Their outlines barely distinguishable through the rain. They didn't move, didn't flinch. They were just watching. Daniel's blood turned ice cold. Lightning flashed, and they were gone. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He turned and ran back to the car. He yanked the door open, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. Emily jumped. "What is it?" Daniel's hands were shaking as he gripped the wheel. "We can't go forward." His voice was hoarse. "The road is gone, completely flooded." Emily's face paled. "Dad." Noah's voice was almost a whisper. "Did you see them?" Daniel's head snapped toward his son. "See what?" Noah swallowed. His small hands clenched his stuffed dinosaur tighter. The people in the trees. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain battered the roof, the steady rhythm filling the heavy silence in the car. Daniel turned fully in his seat, his pulse hammering. "Noah, what did you see?" Noah shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the plush fabric of his stuffed dinosaur. His voice was small, almost afraid to speak the words out loud. "The people," he whispered. "They were standing in the trees, watching us." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. He glanced at Emily, whose face had drained of color. Hannah pressed herself further against the seat, her arms wrapped around her own body. "You saw them too?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Noah nodded slowly. Hannah swallowed hard. "Dad," she hesitated, then finally said, "I saw something too." Daniel's breath caught. It was when the lightning flashed. Hannah continued, her voice almost shaking. "I didn't get a good look, but I saw shapes, tall shapes, and then they were just gone." Emily exhaled shakily. What the hell is happening? Daniel's mind was spinning. The washed-out road was bad enough, but this, the radio static, the distorted voice, the creeping sense of something lurking just beyond their sight. He couldn't explain it. None of it made sense. One thing was certain, they couldn't stay here. He put the car in reverse, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. "We're turning back." Emily nodded quickly. "Yes, please." The SUV rumbled as it backed up, its headlights carving twin beams through the rain. Daniel checked the mirrors, his gut twisting. The road behind them stretched into the darkness, swallowed by mist and shadows. They retraced their path, moving slowly through the storm. The road was still slick, the trees still looming. The rain showed no mercy. Then something shifted. At first, Daniel couldn't put his finger on it. The headlights illuminated the road as they moved, the forest stretching on either side. It looked exactly the same as before, and that was the problem. A creeping unease coiled in his stomach as he glanced at Hannah. "Didn't you say you saw that tree earlier?" Hannah blinked, confused. "Yeah, why?" Daniel inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the wheel. "Because they had just passed it again. The same twisted tree with the broken branch. They were going in circles." Emily noticed it too. No, that's not possible." She shook her head as if trying to force the reality away. "You're going the right way. How can we be back here?" Daniel's hands were cold. He knew he was driving in the right direction. He had followed the road exactly as before. And yet, they were right back where they started. Noah whimpered. "We're trapped." Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, expecting to see only a few minutes had passed. But when he looked, his breath caught in his throat. The clock was frozen. 37 a.m. The time hadn't changed since they had first stopped at the flooded road. The realization hit him like a fist to the chest. Time wasn't moving. Hannah gasped. "Dad, look." Daniel's eyes shot to the road ahead. His blood turned to ice. A figure stood in the middle of the road, tall, unmoving, faceless. just standing there, watching. And then the headlights flickered. The figure was suddenly closer. Emily grabbed Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. Go! Daniel didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, the SUV lurching forward with a roar. But as they sped toward the figure, it simply vanished. The road stretched on, empty. The rain poured harder, but Daniel knew one thing. They were not alone, and they were running out of time. The SUV sped down the rain-slicked road, the wipers struggling against the relentless downpour. Daniel's hands were clammy on the wheel, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The road ahead stretched endlessly, swallowed by shadows and mist. No one spoke. No one dared. Emily's grip on her seatbelt was so tight that her knuckles had turned white. Hannah sat stiffly, her eyes darting between the trees. And Noah, Daniel could hear his shaky breaths, could feel his fear like an electric current in the air. The headlights barely cut through the mist. The deeper they drove, the thicker it became, swirling unnaturally as if it were alive. Then, something changed. Daniel didn't notice it at first. The road still looked the same, winding through the dense forest. The trees still loomed, their gnarled branches stretching toward the car. But the farther they went, the road behind them was gone. Daniel checked the rearview mirror. His stomach twisted. There was nothing but darkness, no road, no trees, just an empty, suffocating void. His hands went ice cold. What the hell? He whispered. Emily turned to him sharply. What? He swallowed hard, glancing at her before nodding toward the mirror. Look. Emily twisted in her seat. The moment she saw it, the nothingness behind them, her breath hitched. Hannah leaned forward, her voice trembling. Dad, where's the road? Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because he didn't know. All he knew was that they were trapped, and the road was disappearing. Daniel gritted his teeth. We have to keep moving. Emily was shaking. Daniel, if the road is vanishing, where are we even going? I don't know, he admitted. But stopping isn't an option. Press the gas pedal a little harder. The SUV rumbled forward, its tires splashing through deep puddles. The storm howled around them, bending the trees at impossible angles. Noah clutched his dinosaur, whispering under his breath. Then, the headlights flickered just for a second. That flicker was brief, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through Daniel's body. He slammed his hand down on the dashboard, trying to get the headlights to stay steady. Stay on, he muttered, his voice low and desperate. But the lights flickered again, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced and stretched across the wet road. The trees around them seemed to lean in closer, their trunks bending as if they were trying to listen to the car's engine. What's happening? Emily's voice cracked, her eyes wide with fear. Why are the lights doing that? Daniel shook his head, his fingers gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. I don't know. This This isn't normal. The SUV surged forward, but as the headlights blinked again, they revealed something in the distance. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. At the far end of the road, through the dense mist, there was something new. A figure. The figure was tall, impossibly so. Its outline was obscured by the rain, but its presence was unmistakable. It stood in the middle of the road, not moving, just staring at them. Daniel's foot froze on the accelerator. The car came to a slow, creeping halt as he stared at the figure, his pulse racing. "Dad, don't stop," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to keep going, now." "I can't just drive past it," Daniel replied, his voice shaking. "What if it's—" Before he could finish, the figure took a step forward. It moved so unnaturally fast that it was almost like the air around it bent. One moment, it was far down the road. The next, it was nearly at the car. Emily screamed, jerking back in her seat. "Go, go, go." Without thinking, Daniel slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. The SUV lurched forward, tires spinning on the slick asphalt. The figure in the road seemed to fade with every second, dissolving into the mist like a phantom. But as they sped away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the figure hadn't moved at all. It had simply appeared closer. The mist thickened again, swirling around the car like a living thing. Daniel fought to see through the windshield, his eyes straining. The road ahead felt like it was becoming a maze, with the trees crowding in from every side. The headlights barely penetrated the fog. "This isn't right," Emily whispered. "We should have reached something by now. A town, a sign, something." "I know," Daniel said, his voice tight. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was still frozen at 2:37 a.m. "How long have we been driving?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with confusion. "It feels like we've been here forever." "We have been," Daniel replied, his heart sinking. He didn't know how to explain it, but something was wrong with the time. "Dad, I need to pee." Noah spoke up from the back seat. His voice was small, muffled by the heaviness of the storm, but it carried an edge of worry. "Can you hold it?" Daniel asked, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "I can't," Noah's voice cracked, and his soft whimper made Daniel's stomach twist. "We'll stop soon," Daniel promised, trying to keep his voice calm, though every instinct inside him screamed to just keep going. He had no idea what lay ahead, what was chasing them. But then, a figure appeared again. This time, it was standing right beside the car. Daniel's breath caught. He swerved, nearly losing control of the SUV. The figure was close. So close, it felt like it was right outside the window. "Dad!" Hannah screamed. Daniel's head snapped to the side. The figure had no face, just an empty, dark void where its features should have been. It wore a long coat that billowed with the wind, but the shadows that clung to it seemed to distort the very air. "Don't stop," Emily shouted, her voice rising in panic. "Go, go now." With a frantic motion, Daniel slammed his foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching in protest as the SUV surged forward. The figure vanished as the car sped past, but the tension in the air only grew. He didn't dare look back. The trees were closing in again. The road had narrowed, and the mist had thickened to a point where they could barely see anything. Danielle's chest felt tight with anxiety, and his eyes darted to the mirrors, expecting to see that faceless figure again. "We can't keep doing this," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep driving around in circles." "I don't know what's happening," Daniel whispered, his hands slick with sweat. I don't know what to do." There was nothing he could do. He was trapped in a maze, a twisted version of reality that shifted and warped around him. The road was disappearing. Time was stuck, and those figures, they weren't just figments of his imagination. They were real. He slammed the steering wheel in frustration. There has to be a way out. There has to be. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Daniel saw something that made his heart stop. A shadow, no, a shape, was moving swiftly along the road. It was tall, impossibly tall, just like the other figures. But this one wasn't standing still. It was following them. Daniel's breath caught. They were being hunted. The shadow moved like liquid darkness, a shape that stretched and contorted in ways no human form should. Daniel's heart pounded as he instinctively floored the accelerator, pushing the SUV harder, as if speed could outrun the unknown. But the shadow, it didn't move like any creature he knew. It glided. He glanced in the rearview mirror. It was closer. The shape, tall, elongated, its outline flickering in the headlights, was not just following them. It was gaining on them, pursuing them with terrifying speed. And as Daniel's eyes locked on it, a chilling realization struck him. The thing wasn't running. It didn't need to run. It was simply there, closing the distance with each passing second, as if it had no need for time or space. "Dad," Emily's voice broke through his panic. It's right behind us." "I know." Daniel's voice was tight with fear. "I can't outrun it. The road's too narrow." He glanced at the narrow strip of asphalt, barely wide enough to fit the SUV as it curved around trees and thick brush. But then the road did something strange. The trees, which had once been tightly packed along both sides, shifted. A split second later, Daniel realized what was happening. The path was narrowing. The trees were closing in, pushing the car toward the edge of the road, and the rain was no longer falling in sheets. It was a constant deluge of water, washing away the land as if trying to drown them. "Dad, I'm scared," Noah whispered from the back seat, his voice small, but full of raw terror. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're not stopping, Noah. We just need to keep going." The road was closing in. The storm was growing, and the space between the trees felt like it was shrinking. "No," Emily screamed. "Daniel, it's too much. We're going to hit something." The SUV jolted as it skidded over a patch of slick road. Daniel wrestled with the wheel, steering the car just to avoid a cluster of thick branches that suddenly grew across the path. His hands were numb with the effort. He could feel the presence of the shadow closing in behind them, and the panic clawing at his chest. "We're trapped," Hannah cried out. "We're going to die out here." Daniel's mind raced. There had to be an answer. They couldn't die like this. Not like this. He pushed forward, his foot pressed to the gas pedal as the shadow grew closer still. It wasn't just an image. It was something alive, a predatory thing that lived in the darkness between the trees. Its form seemed to stretch and distort with every blink. And then, a screech, a high-pitched wail, like the shrieking of metal on metal, tore through the air. The road ahead split, not with a crack of the earth, but with a sickening, grinding sound. It was as if the very path itself had been torn apart, the asphalt bending and cracking like something alive was pulling it apart. "Stop," Emily shouted. "We need to get out. Now." But Daniel couldn't. There was no time. The shadow was too close. His eyes darted to the side as the SUV skidded again, narrowly avoiding the jagged edges of a deep crack in the road that had appeared out of nowhere. This wasn't just a storm anymore. The world around them was falling apart. He slammed his foot on the gas again, but the car jerked violently. The road, what was left of it, was too unstable. The shadow was only inches behind, and now it was reaching for them. In one fluid motion, Daniel turned the wheel, aiming the SUV toward a dense patch of trees on the right. They had no choice but to veer off the road, hoping to find some sort of escape, some sort of way to get off this cursed path. The tires hit dirt, and the SUV jolted violently, the vehicle bouncing over uneven ground. But as Daniel looked up, he realized the trees were alive, branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching for the car. They groaned and crackled in the wind. And just when Daniel thought they had a chance of getting away, the trees closed in around them. "No," Daniel yelled, swerving the SUV to the left, trying to avoid the tree branches as they grew even closer. The vehicle lurched again, the suspension straining against the uneven terrain. He could feel the shadow creeping toward them. He could feel it closing in. In a final attempt to break free, Daniel slammed the SUV into reverse. But before he could get far, the shadow swallowed them whole. Suddenly, the world went pitch black. The rain, the wind, the world itself seemed to stop. A pressure built in the air, thick, suffocating, until it was all Daniel could do to breathe. And then, as quickly as it had come, the pressure lifted. The trees were still there. The storm still raged, but the shadow was gone. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming on the SUV's roof with a deafening beat. The air felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on their chests. Daniel's hands were slick on the wheel, and his heart raced as he tried to steady his breathing. They had managed to escape the shadow, for now, but the fear in the air hadn't dissipated. If anything, it was worse. Emily was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell just happened?" "I don't know," Daniel answered, his voice rough. "But We're not safe. Hannah, her face pale, turned to look out the window, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. Where are we? How are we even still on this road? The road was barely visible through the torrential rain. The headlights did little to illuminate anything beyond a few feet, and the trees around them seemed to stretch endlessly, like a dark, tangled maze. There were no signs, no markers, no indication of where they were. It was as if they had driven into a place that didn't exist. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. It's like the road doesn't end, he muttered. Dad. Noah's voice trembled from the back seat. I'm scared. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror at his son's wide, frightened eyes. Noah had always been the brave one, the one who faced every fear with courage, who spoke his mind without hesitation. But now, Noah was terrified. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. We're going to be okay, Noah. Just hang on. But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it. They continued driving, though Daniel had no idea where they were headed. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the mist hanging heavy like a veil. There was something unnerving about the way the trees seemed to bend inward, pressing closer to the car with every passing mile. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on them, suffocating them, and then a flash of movement. Daniel's eyes shot to the right side of the road, where something had darted into the trees. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick road as he tried to regain control. What the hell was that? Emily gasped, her hand gripping the dashboard. I don't know, Daniel muttered. But we're not stopping to find out. He hit the gas again, the SUV lurching forward. But the strange movement in the trees haunted him. It had been quick, too quick to be human. But what else could it be? Then, the headlights flickered again. And for a brief, terrifying moment, everything went black. A sharp, guttural cry echoed through the night, distant but unmistakable. Daniel's pulse skipped. The sound came from deep within the forest, but it wasn't the sound of any animal he knew. It was a scream that sounded human. He forced himself to keep driving, pushing the gas pedal harder, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The rain slashed against the windshield like a curtain, obscuring his view of the road behind him. He didn't dare look, afraid that if he did, the figure, the shadow, would be there, waiting. We can't keep going like this, Emily said, her voice trembling. We need to stop. We need to figure out where we are, what's happening. No, Daniel said sharply. We can't stop. We don't know what's out there. We need to keep moving. He glanced over at his daughter. Hannah had her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale with fear. Dad, I saw something, she said, her voice small and distant. Daniel's eyes snapped to her. What? What did you see? Hannah swallowed hard, glancing nervously out the window. Eyes everywhere. What do you mean? Not just one set. There were hundreds. They were watching us from the trees. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. And they weren't They weren't human. Daniel's heart froze. The terror in his daughter's eyes was enough to make him shudder. He had seen things out there, things he couldn't explain. But the thought of hundreds of eyes in the trees, watching, waiting, that was something he couldn't fathom. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last as they drove deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to stretch farther, their trunks impossibly tall, their branches knotted together in a twisted embrace. The air was thick, oppressive. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Noah's soft voice broke the silence. "Are we going to die, Dad?" Daniel felt his throat tighten. He didn't know how to answer him. What could he say? That they were in a place that shouldn't exist. That the very road beneath them felt wrong. Like it was changing with every turn, every mile. Instead, he said, "We're going to make it out, Noah. I promise." But deep down, he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. A flicker of light appeared in the distance. It wasn't much. A weak glow, barely visible through the mist. But it was something. "Look," Emily said, her voice tinged with hope. "A light. Maybe we can find help." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't trust it. The road had already shown him too many tricks, too many false promises. But there was no other choice. They had to find a way out. As they drove toward the light, Daniel's mind raced. What if it was another illusion, another trap, leading them deeper into the forest? But there was something else. The closer they got to the light, the more he noticed something strange, something that made his blood run cold. The trees, which had once seemed alive and sprawling, now seemed to stand perfectly still, almost too still. It was as if they were watching. And then, just as they neared the light, Daniel saw it. A set of eyes. They gleamed from the darkness, deep and cold, watching them from the trees. Hundreds, no, thousands of eyes, glowing faintly in the blackness. The forest was alive, and it was watching them. The moment Daniel saw the eyes, his heart nearly stopped. Hundreds, no, thousands of them, glimmering in the dark, like cold, soulless lanterns. They were all around them, watching, unmoving, almost as if they were waiting for something. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles went white. The headlights flickered once again, casting brief flashes of light on the trees. But even when the SUV's beam cut through the mist, the eyes remained unmoving. They were everywhere, just out of the light, hidden in the shadows of the trees, lurking, waiting. "Daniel, what is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Daniel whispered back, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. He could still see them, hundreds of eyes, blinking at different intervals, their reflective surfaces gleaming in the faint glow of the headlights. Noah's voice came from the back seat, shaky and small. "Are they real?" "I don't know," Daniel said again, his mind racing. He kept driving forward, though his pulse was racing, and his hands were slick with sweat. Hannah was the next to speak, her voice barely audible. They don't look human. No, Daniel muttered, his stomach churning. They definitely don't look human. As they passed closer to the trees, the eyes grew more distinct, and Daniel began to see that not all of them were the same. Some were small and round, others were narrow, almost serpentine. Some blinked, while others seemed to be locked in a steady, unblinking gaze. The air inside the SUV grew colder. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that Daniel could see his breath fogging up the windows. "Dad," Noah whispered again. "What's happening? What's going on with the trees?" Daniel didn't know how to answer. The trees, once just a backdrop to their journey, now seemed to take on an unnatural shape. The trunks were too twisted, the branches too large, like skeletal hands reaching out from the dark. The shadows between them seemed to shift, and the wind had become strangely silent, as if the world itself had stopped moving. "Keep driving," Daniel ordered, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need to get away from here." But as he pressed the accelerator, the headlights flickered again, and the car came to a grinding halt. "What the hell?" Daniel muttered, slamming his foot down on the gas. But the wheels spun uselessly in the slick mud. "Dad!" Hannah screamed, her voice filled with panic. "We're stuck. We're not going anywhere." Daniel cursed under his breath and tried to reverse the SUV, but it was no use. They were trapped, the wheels spinning uselessly on the slick ground, the car no longer moving an inch. The eyes in the trees seemed to multiply as the minutes passed. They moved in patterns now, shifting, almost as if they were communicating. And with each blink, the unease grew, the tension in the car escalating. "Get out," Emily said suddenly, her voice sharp and desperate. "We need to get out of here, Daniel. Now." "What? Are you crazy?" Daniel shot back. "We can't go out there. They're watching us." "I know," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "But if we don't move, they'll just close in on us. They're waiting for us to do something." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. Was she right? Were they being watched? Were the eyes somehow waiting for them to make the next move? But even as the thought crossed his mind, a new sound broke through the tension. A low, hissing noise, as if something was sliding through the underbrush, moving closer to them. "What was that?" Emily gasped, her hands clutching the door handle as she leaned toward the window. Daniel didn't have to look. He could feel it. Something was out there. The forest had come alive. The eyes in the trees were not the only danger. A shape emerged from the shadows, moving swiftly and silently across the wet ground. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that twisted unnaturally in the dim light. Its body was obscured by shadows, but the shape was unmistakable. It was the same silhouette that had appeared before. The figure. "Get back in the car," Daniel shouted, his voice filled with urgency. He reached for the door handle, ready to slam it shut, but it was too late. The figure, now unmistakably closer, reached out toward them with a hand that was too long, too bony, its fingers stretching toward the window. The air grew colder, the temperature plunging even further, and the world around them seemed to fade. The figure's eyes, those eyes, shone through the dark, gleaming like those of the things in the trees. But these were different. These were eyes full of something darker, something ancient. Daniel slammed the car door shut just as the figure's hand reached the window. The cold radiated through the glass, seeping into his bones. The SUV's engine roared in protest as he tried to reverse once more, but it was no use. The ground beneath them had shifted, the earth beneath the wheels, suddenly too soft to hold the car. They were stuck in place, and the figure, the shape, was coming closer. "Dad, it's here," Hannah said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's coming." Daniel's pulse raced. He could feel the figure's presence pressing in on them, suffocating them. The air felt thick, as if the very atmosphere around them was closing in, drawing tighter and tighter. In a panic, Daniel threw the SUV into gear and pressed the gas pedal harder. But the car wasn't responding. It was as if they were being pulled. The figure was pulling them in, and all at once, the trees around them seemed to shift, moving closer as if they, too, were part of the same entity. "Daniel," Emily screamed, clutching his arm. "We need to get out of here, now." The figure's long fingers brushed against the window once more, leaving a trail of ice in their wake. The SUV shuddered violently, and then, suddenly, the headlights went out. The darkness closed in. The darkness felt suffocating. The engine sputtered and groaned, its last breath cutting through the silent tension like a final gasp. The headlights had gone out, leaving them in pitch black. The only sound was the soft hum of the rain against the vehicle, its relentless rhythm beating like a death march in the background. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. He gripped the steering wheel with the white knuckles, his breath shallow. The SUV's interior had grown colder by the second, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep from the very air around them. It wasn't just the rain anymore. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The figure outside was still there. He could feel its presence pressing against the car, like a heavy weight. Its fingers had touched the glass. He had felt the chill of its touch, the icy fingers brushing against the window, leaving a trail of frost in their wake. "Dad," Noah's voice was quiet, trembling with fear. "Why won't the car move? Why are we stuck?" Daniel tried the engine again, but it was no use. The car wouldn't start. His breath hitched in panic as he twisted the key again, his mind racing for an answer. But it was as if something had shut the world down around them. They had shut the world down. The trees outside were now far too close. Daniel could see their gnarled branches, twisted and thick, blocking what little light had remained. They seemed to lean toward the car, their shapes distorted in the gloom. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reaching out for them, suffocating them with its endless darkness. And then, there it was again, that hissing sound, low and menacing, moving closer. Something was out there. No, someone. The figure, the shape that had appeared to them before, was circling the car. Its breath, if it even had breath, seemed to be all around them. Daniel could feel the pressure building in his chest. It was getting harder to breathe, like the air itself was being squeezed out. The windows were now fogging up, condensation building faster than he could wipe it away. Every breath he took seemed to come from a distant place, like he was breathing underwater. Daniel. Emily's voice was soft, barely audible over the pounding rain, but he could hear the tremor in it. It's here. I feel it. He turned to look at her. Her face was pale, the terror in her eyes deepening by the second. Hannah was holding on to Noah, her arms tightly wrapped around him, as if she could protect him from the terror that was creeping closer. I don't know what's happening, Daniel muttered, his voice shaking with the weight of it all. But we have to stay calm. We can't panic. But it was hard to stay calm when the forest itself seemed to be moving, shifting, closing in on them. The shadows between the trees were thick, and the trees were so dense now, it felt like the world was closing in. The figure was getting closer. Daniel could feel it in his bones, in the air, in the silence around them. He couldn't see it, not exactly, but he knew it was right outside the car, its presence hanging like a storm cloud ready to burst. And then, a knock. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A sharp tap against the windshield. Not from a branch, not from the rain. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He slowly turned to look at the window where the sound had come from. The windshield was coated in a fine layer of condensation, but through the mist, he could see eyes, more eyes, dozens of them. They stared at him, unblinking. He couldn't breathe. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Daniel, don't look at them. Don't. It was too late. The eyes were everywhere, all around them, on the windshield, on the side windows, on the rear view mirror, eyes in the dark. They weren't human. They were too wide, too unnatural, glowing faintly in the dim light, watching them. Daniel's mind reeled. What were they? What were these things? And why were they here? Watching them, waiting for them. He felt the cold press against the glass, as if something, someone, was standing right next to them, their breath fogging up the window. Then, with a sudden, violent jolt, the windshield wipers kicked on, slashing across the glass and clearing the condensation. For a moment, everything was still, but then the shadow moved again, and this time Daniel saw it, a dark form, long limbs, twisted and unnaturally thin, with a face that wasn't quite human. The features were blurred, distorted by the darkness and the mist, but there was no mistaking the shape. It was standing right in front of the SUV, inches from the windshield. Daniel's blood ran cold. The figure's eyes gleamed from the blackness, cold, alien, as if it had been there for centuries, waiting. The figure raised its hand. A long, bony finger pointed at Daniel, then moved slowly toward the door. It was pointing to the side, toward the trees, and then, as if in response to some unspoken command, The forest shifted again. The trees, the very ground beneath them, seemed to ripple, a slow, methodical movement. The forest wasn't just alive. It was alive with intent. And whatever that intent was, it was clear. Dad. Noah's voice quivered. What does it want? What do we do? Daniel's mind was in turmoil. The only thing he knew for sure was that they couldn't stay here any longer. Get ready, Daniel said, his voice taut. We're getting out. Stay low. Stay together. But as he reached for the door handle, something shifted behind them. A sound, loud, deafening, came from deep within the forest, like a distant growl. And then the car jerked forward. Daniel's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. Something was pulling them. They were no longer in control. The trees parted, revealing a clearing ahead. But the clearing wasn't empty. It was alive. And standing at the edge, waiting, was the figure. The same dark shape. And this time, it wasn't alone. There were others. A line of dark forms stood motionless, their eyes glowing, watching the car as it was pulled toward them. And Daniel knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the forest would never let them go. The SUV lurched forward as though it were being dragged, the tires screeching against the wet earth. Daniel's mind raced, every fiber of his being screaming to break free. But it was as if the very forest had grown roots into the car, holding it fast, pulling it toward something much darker. Daniel. Emily's voice was frantic, her hands gripping the seat in front of her, her eyes wide with terror. We need to get out of here now. I'm trying, Daniel snapped, panic creeping into his voice as he yanked the wheel. But the car wouldn't respond. The clearing ahead was getting closer, its haunting presence growing more suffocating with every passing moment. The eyes were everywhere now, watching them from all directions, gleaming with an unnatural cold light. The figures in the distance, those shadowy, twisted shapes, were slowly coming into focus. There were no words, no movement, only the heavy, unrelenting silence that hung between them. The figures stood like sentinels, blocking any path of escape. Please, Dad, please. Noah's voice broke through the suffocating silence, and Daniel's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. His son was staring out the back window, his face pale, his small hands gripping the seat as if holding on for dear life. What's happening? What are they doing? Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he saw them. The shapes were slowly advancing, closing the gap between them and the car. Each one moved with eerie precision, their long limbs shifting like trees bending in the wind, their eyes never leaving the family. We need to stop, Hannah said, her voice quivering. We need to stop moving. Are you out of your mind? Daniel growled. We don't have a choice. We're stuck. The car shuddered again, the pull becoming stronger. The forest seemed to breathe. No, it was breathing. The trees swayed and whispered, though no wind touched the branches. It was as though the entire forest had grown sentient, and it was drawing them in, closer and closer. Dad, Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she stared out the side window. "Do you see that? There's someone out there." Daniel followed her gaze. Through the thick rain and mist just outside the car, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly tall, almost humanoid, but the proportions were off, wrong in ways that made Daniel's stomach turn. Its head was unnaturally large, its limbs too long, its movements jerky, as though it weren't meant to move in such a way. The figure raised one hand, long, spindly fingers curling toward the car, and then, in one horrifying motion, the figure smiled. The smile was wide, too wide, stretching across its face until it seemed to split the figure's head in two. The eyes, the cold, hollow eyes, never blinked, never moved, as it watched them with an almost hunger that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Dad!" Hannah screamed, her face contorted in terror. "It's smiling at us. We have to go. We have to go now." But it was too late. The pull was too strong. The car was moving of its own accord, its wheels turning despite Daniel's attempts to fight the force that controlled them. He could feel the air around them grow heavier, colder, as though the very atmosphere was shifting, closing in. And then, the worst thing happened. The trees shifted. The shadows moved in ways they shouldn't have, like creatures stalking their prey. Daniel's eyes snapped to the windshield as the clearing ahead transformed before his eyes. The ground, it was no longer solid. The earth itself seemed to ripple, shifting like water. And suddenly there was no road beneath them, only a swirling mass of darkness. The SUV's wheels hit the ground with a sickening thud, and the car slid forward, as if being swallowed by the very forest itself. The interior of the car was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the broken dashboard. The headlights had gone out completely, leaving them in a complete void. "Is everyone okay?" Daniel's voice was shaky as he reached for the door handle, but before he could touch it, he froze. The forest was still there. The air around them had changed. It wasn't the cold, biting air from before. No, this was different. This was something heavier, something oppressive. And then the sound came again, closer this time. That growl, that terrible growl. It was coming from beneath them. It was coming from the ground itself. "Daniel, what is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to move. Now." He threw open the door and shoved himself out of the car, feeling the wet, slippery ground beneath his feet as he staggered. The world around him was pitch black, and the air was thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient and unseen. Behind him, he could hear the others struggling to get out of the car, their footsteps uncertain on the uneven ground. But as they moved, Daniel could feel it. They were not alone. The growl echoed through the air again, but now it wasn't just beneath them. It was all around them. The trees, those twisted, gnarled forms, were closing in, the air growing colder, very ground beneath them beginning to pulse with some unnatural rhythm. "Run!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the dark forest. "We have to go. Now." The others followed behind, their footsteps echoing in the dark, their breaths coming in frantic gasps. But as they moved, Daniel knew one thing for certain. There was no escape. The forest had them now, and it wasn't going to let them go. The forest was alive. That was the only thing Daniel could think as he ran, pulling Emily and Noah along behind him. The ground beneath his feet felt unnatural, soft in some places, as though it were sinking beneath him with every step. The trees, their twisted branches gnarled like skeletal hands, loomed overhead, blocking out what little light remained from the shattered sky. Behind them, the growl reverberated through the air, vibrating through the earth. The sound was deep, primal, as if the very land beneath them were hungry, waiting for them to make a mistake, to stumble, to fall. "Stay close," Daniel shouted, his voice raw as he pulled Noah into his arms, pushing forward through the underbrush. His heart was pounding, each beat a drum of terror. The air was thick and wet, pressing down on him, suffocating him with a heaviness that seemed to seep into his bones. The forest was shifting. He could feel it in his legs, in the earth beneath him, in the way the trees swayed, like something was watching them, moving just out of sight, just beyond their reach. And then the growl came again. It was closer this time, much closer. "Keep running," Daniel urged, his breath ragged as his family struggled to keep pace with him. He dared not look back, afraid of what he might see. But every instinct screamed at him to run faster, to get them all as far away as possible. The shadows seemed to stretch out, reaching for them, pulling at their ankles like tendrils of darkness. Daniel could hear the sound of something crashing through the woods behind them. Something large, something fast. It was gaining on them, its footfalls heavy, like the sound of a beast hunting. He dared a glance behind him. What he saw nearly stopped him in his tracks. The trees weren't just moving anymore. They were shifting, their trunks twisting and groaning like living creatures. They were bending at impossible angles, and from between the trunks, Daniel saw shapes, dark figures, their bodies long and angular, their faces twisted in forms that defied nature. The eyes, those glowing, hungry eyes, were everywhere, peering out from behind the trees, watching, waiting. The figures were closing in. "Run!" Daniel screamed again, his voice hoarse as he pulled Emily forward, his eyes scanning the woods ahead, looking for any sign of a way out. But there was no path. There was no escape. The forest had swallowed them whole, and it was hungry for more. Another crash. This time, it was closer. Too close. Daniel felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. The thing chasing them wasn't just the forest. It was alive. "Daniel!" Emily screamed. "Look!" Daniel's blood ran cold as he turned, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. A massive form was breaking through the trees behind them. A towering creature, dark as night, its body moving in a way that was unnatural, almost like it was gliding through the air. Its face was obscured by a mass of twisted limbs and vines, but its eyes, those glowing, piercing eyes, were fixed directly on him. It was hunting them. "Go, go, go," Daniel yelled, his voice raw with desperation as he pulled his family forward, pushing through the thick underbrush. But the creature was gaining on them, its massive form moving with terrifying speed. The trees around them began to close in, their branches reaching out like fingers, grabbing at their limbs, pulling them into the depths of the forest. Daniel felt the pressure on his chest, the sensation of being swallowed whole, suffocating in the dark. And then the ground shifted. Daniel didn't see it coming. 1 second, he was running, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. And the next, the earth beneath him gave way. He felt himself falling, his feet no longer on solid ground. The world tipped sideways, and before he could react, he was plunging into the darkness. He hit the ground hard. His breath whooshed out of his lungs as he landed in a tangle of sharp rocks and wet earth. His chest burned with the impact, but the pain was nothing compared to the feeling of the darkness pressing in all around him. "Dad!" Noah's voice echoed from somewhere above him, the cry distant, filled with panic. "Dad, are you okay?" Daniel groaned, pushing himself up, his hands scraping against the wet, cold ground. He could hear the frantic sound of Emily calling out to him from above. They were still up there, still safe for the moment. But something was different now. The air had changed. The forest had swallowed him whole, and the darkness was no longer the same. It was thick, heavier, like something ancient and monstrous had settled in around him, closing him off from the rest of the world. There was no light here, no moon, no stars, just an endless sea of blackness pressing in on him from all sides. "Daniel." Emily's voice was closer now. She was descending into the hole after him. "Don't," he began, but the words caught in his throat. The ground beneath him trembled again, and the growl, that terrible primal growl, rumbled through the earth, shaking the very foundation of the world around him. "Dad!" Noah cried, his voice filled with fear and urgency. "What's happening? What is it?" Daniel stood frozen, his pulse racing as the growl came again. But this time, it wasn't just beneath them. It was everywhere, surrounding them, crawling up from the depths of the earth itself. It was as if the ground was alive, feeding them its hunger, its thirst for something they didn't understand. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A light, a faint glow, flickering in the blackness. It was small at first, barely visible, but it was there. It was the only thing that stood out in the abyss of the forest. "Over there," Daniel shouted, pointing toward the light. He didn't know if it was a sign of hope or a trap, but it was all they had. "We have to go." The growl rumbled again, but now it was closer. The creature was near. There was no time to think. There was no time to wonder if they were walking into their doom. "Run!" Daniel shouted, And with that, they moved. They ran toward the light, toward the unknown. As the growl closed in behind them, they had no choice. They had to run. The light was small, flickering like a dying star, but it was their only hope. The forest around them was dark, unnaturally so, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that wasn't their own. The air was thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like it was drawn from somewhere deep beneath the earth, as if the very atmosphere was being swallowed by the darkness. The growl came again. This time, it was right behind them. Daniel's pulse raced, each beat thundering in his ears as he grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her forward, his legs burning with the effort. "Stay close. Don't stop running." Noah was just behind him, his small feet scrambling over the uneven ground. But Daniel could hear the fear in his son's breathing. It was ragged, panicked, and the sound twisted something deep inside him. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not with the growl growing louder and closer, the earth trembling beneath their feet. "Mom, I don't want to die," Noah whispered, his voice breaking. Hannah's arm reached out, pulling him closer, whispering soothing words that Daniel couldn't hear, couldn't focus on. His eyes were fixed on the flickering light ahead, narrowing with the determination to get them there. The light was their salvation, or so he hoped. Behind them, the forest seemed to move. The trees no longer just swayed, they were closing in, their branches twisting and reaching like the arms of some ancient, hungry beast. They weren't just trees anymore. They were something else, something far older, far darker. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave a terrifying lurch, and Daniel felt his foot catch on something, root, stone, or some other unseen obstacle. He fell forward, crashing to the ground with a grunt, the impact jarring his bones. "Dad," Emily cried, pulling him up. Her face was pale with fear, her eyes wide. "We have to keep going. We can't stop." Daniel's heart pounded as he pushed himself up, shaking off the fall. But the pain in his leg was intense. The ground wasn't steady. It seemed to be alive, moving beneath him, shifting like liquid. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to take another step. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Another growl rumbled through the air, this one so loud and close it shook the leaves in the trees, sending a wave of dread crashing over him. Something huge, something terrifying was getting closer. "Run!" Daniel shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "We're almost there." With everything he had, Daniel pushed forward, pulling Emily and Noah with him, his legs aching with every step, his breath ragged. The light ahead grew brighter, its glow casting strange shadows on the ground, and he could feel it, the pull of that light, the promise of safety, or at least the promise of something else. But just as they reached it, the earth beneath them gave one final, sickening shudder. Daniel stumbled, barely catching himself, before falling again. His breath itched in his throat as he looked up, and his eyes went wide with disbelief. The light was not what he thought it was. It wasn't a distant beacon. a signal from some human source. It was a hole, a glowing rift in the earth itself, swirling with an eerie, otherworldly light. It was surrounded by ancient stones covered in moss, but the most unsettling thing was the way it pulsed with an unnatural energy. The air around it seemed to crackle, vibrating with something not of this world. "Dad," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. There was only one thing he could do. The growl sounded again, and this time it was right behind them. The force of it was deafening, shaking the ground beneath their feet. It was closer now, too close, and Daniel knew they had no choice. "Into the light," Daniel shouted, his voice raw with fear. "Now." With one last burst of energy, he pushed them all toward the glowing rift, his heart pounding in his chest as the ground continued to tremble beneath him. His eyes never left the darkness behind them. The sound of that terrible growl growing louder, closer, more monstrous. Then, in a flash of blinding light, they were through. The world around them exploded in brightness, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might go blind. The air was different here, cooler, cleaner, and somehow more alive. The earth beneath his feet felt solid again, the trembling, shifting, pulsing feeling gone. They were no longer in the forest. But where were they? The forest was gone. They stood in a vast, open plain. The sky above them an endless expanse of dark clouds, swirling in a sickly green hue. The landscape stretched out for miles, but there was no sign of life. No trees, no animals, just the desolate expanse of land beneath their feet. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking as she looked around. "I don't know," Daniel said, his throat dry. "But we're safe. For now." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the growl echoed through the air again. But this time, it was distant, fading into the wind. Daniel's chest tightened. It wasn't gone. It was still out there, and they were not alone. The ground around them was littered with strange symbols, carvings in the earth itself, as though the land had been shaped long ago by something far older than any of them could comprehend. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. "What now?" Noah asked, his voice barely a whisper, fear still evident in every word. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing for an answer. But there was only one thought that dominated his mind. They couldn't stay here. They had to move, and fast. The silence around them was deafening. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind, carrying the scent of decay and old earth. Daniel's breath felt ragged in his chest, and though he couldn't see them, he knew his family was just as shaken as he was. They had crossed into something beyond. "We need to keep moving," Daniel muttered, though he didn't know where. The rift, the glowing portal, had closed behind them with a shuddering pulse, leaving them standing in the midst of this strange, barren landscape. The sky overhead churned, a roiling mass of dark clouds that seemed to swirl around an unseen force. almost as though they were being watched from above. But there was nothing, no sign of life, no obvious threat, just the oppressive emptiness. "Dad, I don't like this." Noah's voice came, strained, filled with fear. He was standing next to Daniel now, clutching his arm tightly. Daniel looked down at his son's wide, frightened eyes, the same terror reflecting in Emily and Hannah's faces. "We don't have a choice, Noah," Daniel said softly, his voice steady, though his insides were churning. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't risk it. The growl from the forest was fading, but it wasn't gone. He could still feel its presence, like a shadow looming over them. The darkness they had narrowly escaped was still out there, waiting. "Where are we?" Emily's voice trembled. She was clutching Hannah's hand tightly. The younger girl's face pale. "This doesn't feel real, Dad. This isn't real." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know, but we have to keep moving. We can't just stand here." He turned, his eyes scanning the barren landscape. The land stretched out in every direction, devoid of any discernible features. There were no landmarks, no trees, no animals, just endless flat earth. He could barely see the horizon, swallowed by the dark storm above them. It felt like they were in the center of some vast, desolate world, separated from everything they knew. "Look!" Noah's voice broke through Daniel's thoughts, sharp with sudden urgency. He pointed toward the distance. A faint glow shimmered in the far distance, different from the rift they had passed through. It wasn't as intense, but it pulsed like a soft heartbeat, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. "There's something out there," Noah said. Daniel hesitated. The light didn't look like the rift. It didn't have the same otherworldly energy. It felt different, almost welcoming in a strange, unsettling way. But they had no other choice. They couldn't stand in this emptiness. "All right," Daniel said, his voice firm, though his gut twisted with the uncertainty of their path. "We'll head for it." With a silent nod, the family started walking, the faint glow guiding their steps. The ground beneath them felt firm, yet somehow unnatural, like they weren't supposed to be there, as if the earth itself was unsettled by their presence. Every footfall seemed to reverberate in the silence, though the eerie quiet was somehow more suffocating than comforting. The weight of their isolation pressed down on them with every step. Minutes passed, then hours. The light never seemed to get any closer, but neither did it fade. It pulsed like a heartbeat in the distance, driving them forward. "Dad, I'm tired," Hannah said, her voice small and weary. "Why is it taking so long?" Daniel looked down at his daughter, her face pale and strained. She wasn't wrong. It felt like they had been walking for days, yet the light was always just out of reach. "Stay strong, honey," Daniel said, giving her a small, reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. Was this some kind of test? Some endless loop meant to trap them in this desolate place? He couldn't say for sure, but he couldn't stop. They had no choice. We're almost there, he added, trying to force a confidence into his voice. But something felt wrong. The air had grown colder. The ground beneath them was beginning to shift again, like something was pulling at it from beneath. The sky overhead churned even more violently, the clouds swirling faster, as if gathering some unseen force. Daniel could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a pressure, a weight, like they were being drawn towards something beneath them. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave a soft tremor. "What's happening?" Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. Then it happened. The earth beneath their feet cracked open, sending a jagged, horrifying sound through the air, as if the very land was breaking apart. Daniel grabbed Emily's arm instinctively, pulling her close as the ground trembled beneath them. The fissure stretched wide, a deep crack in the earth that seemed to swallow up the horizon. A deafening roar echoed from within it, a sound that vibrated through the ground and into their bones. It was not a growl this time, but something much more primal, something deeper, like the very heart of the earth itself was groaning with hunger. Without warning, a monstrous, jagged shape shot up from the crack, a spire of obsidian rock, black and jagged, reaching toward the sky like some ancient, twisted monument. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the thing crawling out of it, a shape, massive, dark, and shifting like liquid shadow, began to emerge from the crack. Its form was in constant flux, its features unfathomable, a dark mass of twisting limbs and enormous, glowing eyes. Its presence was suffocating, like it had been waiting for them. "It's coming," Noah screamed, his voice cracking with fear. Daniel didn't have time to think. There was no time. He grabbed Emily and Noah by the hands, pulling them toward the faint light in the distance. But the ground beneath them was splitting apart, the very earth tearing at the seams. "We have to move, now," Daniel shouted, panic rising in his throat. They ran. The earth beneath them groaned in protest, the crack widening further, and the thing, whatever it was, loomed larger with every passing second. Its eyes burned with a hellish glow, and the ground beneath it seemed to writhe, as if it were a part of it, an extension of its power. But the light, there, the faint glow was just ahead. They pushed forward with everything they had left. The world seemed to be collapsing around them, the ground breaking apart beneath their feet. With one final push, they reached the light, and then everything went dark. When the darkness consumed them, Daniel felt a momentary weightlessness. There was no air, no ground beneath his feet, just an endless void that wrapped around him like the breath of some ancient beast. He couldn't hear his family, couldn't feel them, but he was acutely aware of their presence. He held on to the sensation of them, like a lifeline in the vast, endless blackness. The darkness wasn't cold, nor was it warm. It was a complete absence of feeling, like floating in the middle of a dream, where time didn't exist, and everything was both too much and nothing at all. Daniel's body felt numb. His mind weighed down with the terror of not knowing whether they were still alive, whether this place was even real. Then, as suddenly as it had taken them, the void released them. Daniel gasped as his feet slammed back into solid ground. He stumbled, disoriented, but strong hands caught him. He didn't even need to look to know it was Emily and Noah, pulling him back upright, their presence grounding him in the midst of confusion. The air was thick, but this time not suffocating. It was cool and alive with a strange hum. He could hear the sound of wind, soft at first, then building in intensity as the familiar, sharp crackling of the sky filled the air. But this was not the same storm from before. Daniel's senses slowly returned, and he forced himself to focus. They were no longer in the barren expanse. In fact, they weren't even on the same landscape anymore. The sky above them had cleared, and while it was still dark, there were no ominous clouds swirling overhead. Instead, the sky was a dark indigo, dotted with stars that blinked like far-off flames. It was both familiar and alien. The ground beneath them was soft, almost cushiony, as though the earth had taken on the qualities of something alive, something that cared about their presence. "Where are we?" Emily whispered, her voice small, but it carried in the eerie silence. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his mind. There was no immediate threat here. No growls, no beasts chasing them. The earth beneath his feet, though strange, didn't feel hostile. But that didn't make it safe. There was something unsettling about the calm. "I don't know," he muttered, "but we have to keep moving." There was no light here, not like the one they had seen before. But in the distance, something far brighter than any star caught Daniel's attention. It was a glow, pulsating gently, shifting and shimmering like the last dying embers of a fire. A beacon, perhaps, a sign, or another trap. He couldn't tell yet. "We should head toward it," Daniel said, trying to sound confident. Without waiting for anyone to respond, he started walking, the familiar weight of the earth beneath his boots feeling strangely comforting in the absence of the otherworldly forces that had pursued them. The others followed closely behind, their steps tentative but determined. The closer they came to the glow, the more Daniel began to feel a change. It was as if the air was alive around them, buzzing with energy, an electric charge running through it. But it wasn't oppressive. It was, in fact, inviting. "We've been walking for a long time," Noah said, breaking the silence. He sounded exhausted, but there was an edge of curiosity in his voice. "What if this place is just not real, like a dream or something?" Daniel paused, glancing back at his son. The words struck him like a cold wind. It was a possibility he had considered. It all felt too strange, too impossible. But if it wasn't real, then why did it feel so solid? Why could he feel the weight of his body? Why did the cold night air sting his lungs? "We have to take the chance," Daniel said softly, turning back to face the light. They were only a few steps away now. "I don't know what this place is, Noah, but we need to see it for ourselves." We can't just wander forever. Closer they got, the more intense the light became. But it wasn't blinding. It wasn't like the rift they had passed through. This was gentler, like the dawn breaking over a dark horizon. As they reached the center of the glowing field, Daniel felt the presence of something older, deeper, and wiser than anything he had encountered. Then, a soft hum filled the air, a frequency that vibrated in his bones, as though the earth was speaking directly to him. It was almost like the hum of the storm before, but it was different, calming, almost inviting. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense. It was more of a deep, resonant thought that passed directly into Daniel's mind. The words weren't in any language he understood, but they resonated with something primal and deep inside of him. Welcome. You are at the crossroads. Daniel staggered back, his chest tightening with panic. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He could feel his family behind him, but he couldn't turn to face them. His focus was locked on the glow ahead, the overwhelming presence that emanated from it. You have crossed, but the path ahead is fraught with trials. The answer you seek lies beyond the trial of choice. Dad, Emily's voice, now laced with fear. She reached for his arm, pulling him back from the glowing presence. What's happening? What is that? The words in Daniel's mind felt heavy, like they were meant to be understood, but they were also wrapped in mystery. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. I don't know, Daniel said, his voice weak. But we can't stay here. Before they could move, the light pulsed and a shimmering pathway appeared at their feet. It stretched out before them, like an ancient road leading into the unknown, glowing with an ethereal energy that seemed to beckon them forward. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air. Choose wisely, choose swiftly, for what lies ahead will shape your fate. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the path that lay before them. The answer to everything, their survival, their escape, was just beyond that threshold. But it wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just a path forward. It was a choice. And in a place like this, choices came with consequences. Do we take it? Noah asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the question. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. They were going to have to take the leap and face whatever lay beyond. The glowing path stretched out before them like a thread of fate. It shimmered under their feet, casting ethereal reflections across the soft earth. It seemed harmless, inviting almost, too inviting. But Daniel could feel something else beneath the surface of that calm. It wasn't just a road. It was a test, a choice they had to make. And in this world, in this strange place, choices were never simple. He looked down at his family, each face reflecting their own unique brand of fear and uncertainty. Emily's eyes were wide, filled with confusion and doubt. Noah was looking ahead with a strange, determined expression, though His lips trembled slightly. Hannah stood close to Daniel, clutching his hand tightly, her small fingers squeezing in silent reassurance, though she too seemed uncertain about the path before them. "Dad," Noah's voice broke through the silence. "What if we're not supposed to go down there? What if we're meant to go back, find the rift again?" Daniel's heart clenched. The idea of going back, of returning to that broken, shattered forest, was terrifying. The growls, the creatures lurking in the darkness, they were still out there. But what if this was another trap? What if the path was a lie, designed to lead them deeper into danger? "We can't go back," Daniel said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "The rift's closed. We can't afford to be stuck here, to not move forward. We have to take a chance. Whatever this is, whatever this place is, it's giving us an opportunity. We have to take it." Hannah, standing beside him, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. She didn't understand everything, but she trusted him. That small gesture of faith was enough to bolster his resolve. "Okay, we'll go," Emily said quietly, glancing down at the glowing path and then back at her father. There was hesitation in her voice, but also a decision. She was ready to move forward, even if she wasn't sure what waited for them at the end. Noah swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously across the horizon, but after a long pause, he nodded. "We're with you, Dad." The decision was made. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the glowing pathway. His family followed close behind, their steps tentative but firm. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The farther they walked, the more the ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as though the earth itself was reacting to their presence. The path twisted and turned, weaving through strange landscapes that seemed to exist in two states at once. One moment, they were walking through a dense forest with towering trees, their leaves shimmering with a strange metallic hue. The next, they were crossing a barren wasteland, the ground cracked and scorched, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The light from the path never wavered, though the surroundings shifted unnaturally with each step. Daniel's mind raced. Where was this place? Why was it so unpredictable? It wasn't just the environment that was changing. The feel of the place was shifting too. The air was growing colder, the pulse in the ground stronger, almost like the earth was breathing. And with every passing moment, he felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightening, like something was trying to pull him deeper into the world they had entered. "Dad." Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension hanging in the air. "Do you feel that?" He nodded, glancing down at her. "I do. It's like something is pulling us forward." They kept moving, faster now, not wanting to stop. But the sensation of being watched was growing stronger. Something was following them, something that they couldn't see but could feel. "Stay close," Daniel ordered, though his own voice was laced with unease. The energy around them had shifted again, becoming more intense. The pulsing from the ground was deeper now, almost as though the land itself was waking up. The stars in the sky seemed to flicker as if they were on the verge of burning out. Suddenly, the path split. A sharp, jagged break in the earth appeared in front of them. On one side, the path continued, its soft glow stretching far into the distance. On the other side, there was only darkness, nothingness, like a void that swallowed everything around it. Daniel stopped, staring at the divide. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it deafening in his ears. The choice had become even clearer now. They could continue on the illuminated path, or they could risk the darkness. The glow on the other side of the divide was faint, just a flicker, but it pulsed with an energy that felt like it was pulling at him, beckoning him to cross. The choice was now inescapable. Which way? Noah asked, his voice trembling. He was standing at the edge of the divide, looking from one path to the other, unsure of which direction to take. His eyes flicked back to Daniel, waiting for an answer. But Daniel didn't know. He couldn't know. I don't know, Daniel said, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. The pressure in his chest grew heavier. He looked at the two paths, his mind racing with possibilities. The glowing path had been leading them so far, but now it split. The darkness on the other side seemed like an abyss, a place of unknown danger. But then a thought crossed his mind. Maybe it's not about which path we take, Daniel said, his voice quieter than before. Maybe it's about what we take with us. The choice isn't between the paths, but about what we carry into the unknown. He glanced down at his family. They had been through so much already. The terror of the storm, the endless uncertainty. Whatever was waiting for them here, they had to face it together. And so, without another word, Daniel stepped toward the glowing path, holding on to the certainty that it was the right choice for them. At least for now, his family followed him without hesitation. But as they crossed the divide, the ground beneath them gave another tremor, more intense than before, and something shifted in the air. The moment Daniel set foot on the glowing path, the ground beneath them trembled again. But this time it was different. The trembling was deeper, more pronounced, and the air around them grew heavy, thick with an electric charge that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. The light ahead flickered, then steadied as if acknowledging their decision. The pulse in the earth seemed to quicken with every step they took, and Daniel could hear the beat in his chest matching it, an unsettling rhythm that reverberated through his bones. It wasn't just the land that was alive here. It was as if the very atmosphere was conscious of their movement, watching them, feeling them. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were being tested, like every step was an entry deeper into a place they weren't meant to be. They moved cautiously, but steadily, their eyes darting around, watching for any sign of danger. The light from the path illuminated their surroundings, just enough to make out twisted shapes in the distance. Distorted trees, massive boulders, and strange shifting forms that seemed to blur with the movement of the wind. Yet none of these things seemed to get closer. It was as if they were moving through a world that was both static and dynamic, the very fabric of it constantly in flux. And then, the first sign of movement. A figure appeared ahead, faint at first, a blur in the distance. It wasn't human. It wasn't even fully tangible. It shifted in and out of existence, flickering between the shadows like a mirage. And with each blink of an eye, it became more real, more solid, a tall, elongated shape, its features indistinct, but somehow familiar. The more Daniel tried to focus on it, the more it seemed to slip away, fading at the edges of his vision. "Dad, what is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his heart racing. "Stay close." The figure grew clearer as they walked toward it, and as they neared, Daniel felt the pressure in the air increase, a palpable tension settling around them. His feet dragged as if the ground had turned to molasses, pulling him back, trying to keep him from reaching the strange figure. He fought against the resistance, but his legs felt heavy, like he was moving through water. The figure stopped flickering. It solidified into something more distinct, something that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. It was a man, but not a man in any sense he understood. He was tall, impossibly tall, with skin that gleamed like polished stone, smooth and gray, almost liquid in appearance. His eyes, glowing faintly with the same eerie pulse as the path, locked onto Daniel, and a voice, deep and ancient, boomed through his mind, not spoken aloud, but felt, heard in the deepest part of his soul. "You have come." "Why?" the voice echoed, reverberating through the air, and Daniel felt the weight of it press down on him. He couldn't speak. He couldn't think. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, an image flashed through his mind. An image of the rift they had passed through, the forest they had left behind, the storm, the growls, the threat they had narrowly escaped. "You seek to escape the storm, to survive." Daniel nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from the creature's unblinking eyes. He felt exposed, as if every thought, every fear, was laid bare before this strange being. It was as though it could see into him, into their very souls. But survival is not guaranteed. Not here, not in this place. The words were heavy, laden with a cold certainty that made Daniel's heart race. The figure's eyes narrowed, and the world around them seemed to shift again, as though it were responding to the being's will. The path you choose is fraught with more than just danger. It is a trial, and you're not the first to walk it. Many have come before you, and many have failed. Daniel felt a cold chill crawl down his spine, and for a moment he wanted to turn back, to run away from this strange creature and whatever it represented, but he couldn't. They had come too far. There was no turning back now. "What is this place?" Daniel finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse with the pressure in the air. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought he saw a flicker of something human in its gaze. Something like empathy, or maybe pity, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. This is the crossroads, the place where all paths meet, a place of choice, of judgment. The road you walk will determine what lies ahead, life or death. The storm you escaped was just the beginning. This trial will not be kind to you. The ground beneath them shuddered again, and the figure began to fade, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. You must decide now. The choices you make will decide everything. Choose wisely, for the consequences are greater than you realize. The figure disappeared completely, leaving only the pulsing light of the path ahead, now dimmer than before, as if the being's presence had drawn some of its energy away. The air felt heavy now, oppressive, as though the weight of the decision they had yet to make was bearing down on them. Dad, Emily's voice trembled, and Daniel turned to see her face pale with fear. What does it mean? What trial? I don't know, Daniel said, swallowing hard. He didn't want to say it out loud, but the truth was creeping into his thoughts. They were not just being tested by the storm anymore. They were being tested by this place, by whatever forces ruled it, and whatever lay ahead wasn't going to let them pass without a cost. We need to keep moving, Daniel said, his voice steady, though his insides were churning. He didn't have all the answers. Hell, he didn't have any answers, but he couldn't stand still. Not now. They had come this far. They had no choice but to move forward. The path continued to stretch out before them, more treacherous now, darker, the light growing dimmer with each step. And in the distance, something began to stir. The air was thick with unease as Daniel led his family further along the path. Every step seemed to sink deeper into the strange energy of the crossroads, where the very earth pulsed beneath their feet like a heartbeat that was not their own. The path ahead was no longer inviting. It was foreboding, the light dimming to a cold, unnatural glow, and the shadows that stretched from the trees to the distant hills felt oppressive, alive, watching. I don't like this, Noah murmured, his voice low, his eyes scanning the horizon with a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. It's too quiet. There's something wrong here, something watching us. Daniel didn't reply immediately. He couldn't, not without admitting that Noah was right. There was something wrong. The figure they had encountered, its words, the pulsing energy in the air. It all felt like a trap, but it was also a test. The crossroads wasn't just a physical place. It was a test of their resolve, of their will to survive. Emily walked close beside him, her gaze flicking from the shadows to the ground ahead. She was tense, each step deliberate, her body coiled as if waiting for the world to snap around them. It was clear that none of them felt safe. The world they had stepped into didn't make sense, and every instinct told Daniel to protect them, to keep them moving, keep them safe. But how could he do that when the ground beneath them seemed to shift with every passing moment? Hannah, stay close, he said softly, his voice a quiet command as he reached for his youngest daughter's hand. She was gripping his fingers tightly, her face pale and wide-eyed. Her silence was more terrifying than anything he'd encountered in this place. Suddenly, a low, distant rumble echoed across the land, a deep sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a natural sound at all. It was something alive, something huge. Daniel froze. His heart pounded. The rumble was growing louder, and the ground beneath them trembled again, more violently this time. The shadows ahead seemed to shift, as if the darkness itself were moving. Something was coming. "We need to move faster," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. But even as he spoke, the light of the path flickered and died. The glowing thread beneath their feet vanished, and the only light left in the world was the eerie glow of the distant, shifting horizon. Daniel's heart skipped. They were blind now, stumbling forward on a path they could no longer see. The threat of the unknown pressing in on them from all sides. "Dad, what's happening?" Noah's voice was tight with fear. His words seemed to crackle in the thick air around them. "I don't know," Daniel whispered. He could feel the change in the atmosphere. A pressure building in the air, suffocating, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Suddenly, from the dense shadows ahead, something moved. A shape, massive and dark, rose from the ground with unnatural speed. It wasn't a creature, at least not in the way Daniel understood creatures. It was more like a shadow, a living shadow, vast and stretching across the horizon like an inky black tide. The form swirled and writhed, its shape impossible to define, but its presence unmistakable. It was a being, something older than time itself. The ground beneath their feet seemed to dissolve as the shadow advanced, engulfing the path ahead, blotting out the dim light they had been following. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. They were paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the sheer magnitude of the shadow before them. "No," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is it? What do we do?" Daniel felt the terror grip him, a primal fear that surged up from the pit of his stomach. He could feel it too, the weight of the shadow pressing in on them. But there was something else, something more subtle. The shadow wasn't just fear. It wasn't just darkness. It was waiting. "Move!" Daniel finally shouted, snapping them out of their trance. The words didn't feel like they were his, but rather a reflex, something his body instinctively knew he had to do to survive. He yanked Emily and Noah forward, his other hand gripping Hannah's hand tightly. They ran, stumbling as they tried to find their footing in the growing darkness. The shadow was everywhere now, suffocating, and behind them, the rumbling grew louder, closer, but the path had disappeared. The light was gone, and with it, any sense of direction. They were no longer in a world of rules they understood. There was no way forward. There was only the endless abyss ahead, and the constant terrifying sense that the shadow was pulling them toward it. "Dad, what's happening?" Noah's voice broke through his panic. "I don't know," Daniel said, his voice shaking. He had no answers. There was no plan. The fear that had gripped his heart for so long was giving way to a desperation. They were losing themselves in the dark. But we can't stop moving. We have to keep moving. The rumbling grew louder, almost deafening now. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and Daniel could feel the earth breaking open beneath them. The ground seemed to be devouring them, pulling them toward the void. Suddenly, without warning, the ground beneath Daniel's feet cracked open, the earth splitting apart like an ancient wound.